welcome back to Requiem Radio. With us today, we have someone that me and Hazy both been on his show before, a fellow content creator and someone who is interested in politics. Purple Political Breakdown. Really glad to have him on our show today. He currently is talking about things across the political landscape in this era and mostly arguing about what's been going on, the ideological split we've been seeing. Some say he's here to stir the pot. Other people say he's here for our convenience. We say he's here as a good friend of ours and a guest on Requiem Radio. Hazy, want to go ahead and say hey for the audience, and we'll go over to Riddell, our friend.
Hello, audience. It's Hazy Dialects returning, as I know I've been absent for some episodes, but returning here, and I'm glad that I'm returning with Riddell, someone I've had a good talk to on his own platform, which you should check out that episode. I highly recommend it. It was a very interesting and intriguing episode due to the questions that was asked by our guest today, and I'll allow it to be discussed further about other things he does. Not only does he do podcasting, but he also does anime. So if you ever on that niche of the internet, you might want to delve into his content there. But Randall, can you talk to our audience and just give a short introduction as to who you are?
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for introducing me. As they said, my name's Riddell. I host a podcast that is now officially returned after a little bit of a hiatus called The Purple Political Breakdown. Very simply, my motto is political solutions without political bias. I try to have conversations that is pushing the narrative, pushing the conversation, regardless of the ideological side you may align on in terms of the political spectrum. That's something I'm going to be doing. I got a new format where I'll be kind of moderating. Some episodes I'll still have 1v1 conversation, but moderating a conversation between two people who disagree and see if we can actually create a productive conversation from that. But yeah, I'm here to do that, of course. And yeah, I do like anime as well, but appreciate having me on.
Yeah, it's good to have you on. And I remember when Requiem Radio, we were actually starting off. If you recall, we were originally part of a group called Blind Knowledge. And at the time, it were hosted about, what was it, Hazy, 30 people roughly on that platform. There's something wrong with that line. And most of the people, most of the people there, no disrespect to them, kind of lightweight in that sense, where I'm like, okay, we could push harder and be better than them. But you were always really good competition for us in viewership. And anytime we were looking at reviews and then having Blind Knowledge show us, like, overall, he's like, yeah, Riddell is usually our top seller, our top guy. So it's definitely been fun competition going neck to neck for you in viewership.
Yeah, friendly competition's always good in a lot of different areas, but always something to keep in mind is not only are you competing with each other, but you're competing with yourself to constantly. I always try to do, depending on the niche that I'm in, as well as garner these relationships, these connections for, not only crossing your fan base's audience and communities, but to, cross over or share ideas, potential ways to improve. So, yeah, I likewise, Requiem Radio has been very good people to communicate with and discuss politics. And they got an interesting perspective compared to a lot of the guests I've had on my podcast thus far.
Yeah, speaking of that, for the audience and backstory for you, what really inspired you to get into political commentary or content creation as a whole? Was it a certain moment, or was it a gradual thing that happened where you're like, maybe I should do this?
I would say it's more of a gradual thing, but a moment pushed it towards the content sphere. Definitely started out when I was younger, trying to decide what I want to do. When I was older, and for the most part, I would maybe even narcissistically say that I was a pretty smart individual ever since I was pretty young, very mature for my age, as people say constantly. And I know I didn't want to do like the pro athlete, the actor, any of those entertainment venues necessarily. So I was trying to figure out what exactly I wanted to do. And it was politics. By the time I was like junior in high school, I kind of realized that, yeah, I might become a lawyer, but ultimate goal was to be involved in politics because the value of politics and how it shapes the country and people is extremely important. As we see nowadays, almost everything is dictated by politics. So it's reaching a pretty controversial point, I would say that. But as I grew up, I was trying to figure out how I wanted to do that. I joined the military, and did that for a couple of years. I was also going to college as well. So I got my degree. I decided the military is not for me. I was in the Marine Corps, and it's not that it was too hard, but one, I struggle just like blindly listening to orders. Is just not something I want to do on a consistent basis when I think the orders aren't smart, but that's what you have to do if you're in the military. And two, it doesn't allow me the freedom to kind of do things the way I want to. So when I learn more about politics and learn more about like the structure of government throughout the military, I realized that I would basically have to choose a side between Democrat and Republican as I grow further. And eventually, as I was like coming to the end of my college tenure and I went back home in Virginia, I was trying to figure out how I want to approach things. Went on the content space, looked at YouTube and all that stuff, found these different kind of content creators, saw the Democrats, saw the Republicans, just thought that it was a mess. It's even more of a mess now. And I was like, I want to do things my own way. And that is when I decided to create a podcast, create my own platform, and decide to go through politics in a way that is, I believe, productive versus more toxic way of doing things from the left and the right. I don't see why we need to choose a side. For the most part, what we do want is a better country. So all of that kind of led up to me creating the podcast and creating my content space. And then here we are today.
If I may ask, what year was that roughly for you when you said you were checking out who were the content creators doing things?
What year?
It was like a mess. Ballpark guess, yeah.
I would say probably the year before COVID. So around 2019 is when I started thinking about it. COVID is probably when I started thinking about making content. And then 21 is when the podcast started forming. 22, 21, around that time. And then we're trying to figure out how to do things, learn about YouTube and all that stuff. That's when I started learning about content. I would say the political podcast actually was probably much later on 2023 when I officially started that.
Nice. Sounds good. Yeah, I was asking that question because I noticed a trend. I'm sure I'd love to hear Hazy comments on this as well. That when it comes to political content creation, you notice that's a very heavy pendulum swing where there'd be a certain era that's like dominated by one voice and it'll swing the other way. So example, I could say the 2016 was the anti-SJW era where it was swinging very heavy right, where that was the oversaturation of like right-wing voices. Then post-Trump, in defense of the Biden was a very heavy swing left for like, left-speaking voices like Vosh or Destiny or Sean or a handful of these guys. And I'm noticing now it's starting to be almost in the middle point. It's about to start swinging heavy right again, to where it's a lot of like right-wing speakers who are coming back up and trying to throw their hat in the ring. But it's definitely been interesting watching the back and forth in politics for content creators.
Yeah, I definitely noticed that as well. When it comes down to the content I would say I actually consumed a lot, especially in college, right-wing content. I mean, we remember when Change My Mind was huge, when Steven Crowder actually mattered again. And in that Change My Mind, you get to see all these different conversations, and the left would look very unhinged. And that was very eye-opening. But then a lot happened later, COVID and the anti-vaxxers, Donald Trump, more stuff regarding trans issues. And now we're here today. I'm like, bro, they're both unhinged. So that's kind of how we arrive where we are right now.
Definitely. Hey, Z, is there anything you want to comment on that?
In terms of the digital landscape, I definitely understand how that's been polarizing for quite some time. Initially, it was definitely more of a new wave atheism that was the predominant scale of commentators that would basically monopolizing the majority of content creation at the time, mostly commentaries and responses to religion, religiosity in general. But the early 2000s, the countercultural wave and narratives have their ways, as you've mentioned before, the pendulums and how it swings. Naturally, if your parents were kind of like religious in some regard, some people striving in their own way might knee-jerk or necessarily become atheists or hardline counter narratives or in their core fundamental beliefs. And that's way blended pretty easily into the anti-SJW wave of content creation. look back on it sometime when you get a chance, you'll notice that a lot of people that were dominant and growing during the time period of the SJW wave were part of the new atheist wave. A lot of commentators who were making videos about religiosity. Armored Skeptic is a notable example that comes to mind for this. As for left-wing surge or influx of people who were doing that, Destiny was probably one of the most prominent content creators that didn't kind of go into the leftist fragility sort of monologuing or the archetype that people would have expected. So it was refreshing to some regard, and that's probably why so many prominent figures such as Hassan Piker or Vosh came from his community, since they didn't have to restrain themselves into the confines of what you might see a video essayist do in terms of civility, politics, and in their engagement with certain ideas and sort of argumentum. So it was very intriguing, to say the least, to see how that political awakening for a lot of people who, for the most part, have grown up being on the internet, have now become some of the voices of the internet, and seeing all that transpired within the last 5 to 10 years has been quite fascinating from my perspective in terms of how this has all been transpiring.
It's funny you mentioned the new wave atheists. I almost forgot them when it came to political discussions, but you're right. There was a time where they were like the earliest right-wing, political people who were taking mics. And funny enough, I'm sure everyone here has heard now, nonsensically, facts don't care about your feelings, that saying. And you attribute that to Ben Shapiro, but it was actually Richard Dawkins that was the first person to say that. And that was like something he'd use against like theists and like arguments. And it's kind of funny watching how something like that would just get hijacked and used by someone else. But Riddell, a question I have for you. Has there been any individuals or content creators that have influenced you at all in your journey?
Well, to kind of narrow it to like the political landscape, I know you're not a big fan of him, but Destiny for sure has been a somewhat of I wouldn't call him like, a role model or anything for me at the very least. But I found the conversations he was having interesting, especially considering he wasn't kind of getting to that unhinged leftist point of view from like people like Hassan or Vosh. And it was definitely more nuanced, to the point where even some of his conversations will lean right, and the people on the left will call him a right-winger. So that type of nuance was definitely appreciated. Of course, there's things that I do not like about Destiny in terms of his conduct and certain other aspects as well, but he is a voice that made it big, that was able to kind of reach that more closer to the center type content sphere. And another one would be Ben Shapiro, even though Ben Shapiro recently has been unhinged, in my opinion. But Ben Shapiro is kind of, like you said earlier, the facts over the feelings type guy. And I appreciate the more logical approach that he kind of went into it, that aspect to go up against left-wingers, stick to the facts, stick to logic, stick to whatever the truth is to him, and really not get into these personal attacks or these emotional retorts. So Ben Shapiro and Destiny probably were the two main ones, and Jordan Peterson was, but I think Jordan Peterson got pretty unhinged as well. So it's kind of interesting that these guys, I was like, hey, you guys seem more factual, nuance. Nowadays, I'm looking at them and it's like,
yeah, Steven Crowder as well should be on that list. It's
for sure
the age-old tale that you either die a hero or live long enough to see yourself become a villain. And unfortunately, that's the case for a lot of content creators from like that era of politics, where now they're just doing their own thing. Let's just put it that way politely. But it's kind of funny you mentioned that about Destiny, though. I agree, where like there's times he'd argue and it seemed right-wing. Because I remember he was arguing against Vosh because Vosh was saying during like the BLM riots that it's okay for Black people to go around and destroy local stores, and even much he said Black people should like walk around with like guns and go into like white suburban neighborhoods. And Destiny is like, what are you, insane? Are you trying to like start a race war? Like, and it's kind of funny because like Vosh and his crowd called Destiny right wing for saying that, while Destiny was like, you're not going to get anything done by like threatening people with guns and intimidating them in their own neighborhoods. You're just going to make people hate you more.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, even right now, even though he's doing a lot of the kind of anti-Trump stuff, which, I'm on team anti-Trump as well, he's also advocating for pro-Israel in a lot of his conversations at the same time. So a lot of the people who are pro-Palestinian, who are usually on the left, they hate Destiny. Right? So I respect the willingness to kind of go through. One thing that he does that I do as well is you go through things with the lens of based off your own personal value system, which is why I respect that kind of approach, even though we don't value things equally like me and him. But that allows yourself to kind of look at things based off a logic that you believe is correct without getting captured by an ideology just to follow what that ideology says. So that is one thing I respect from him and what he does, because I've done that for my entire life as well. And I'm going to be honest, nowadays, I don't really see a lot of, big content creators doing that.
Yeah, it feels like a lot of people ended up selling out, unfortunately. Go ahead, Hazy.
I was just going to say that I feel like despite the confrontation that a Destiny, a Ben Shapiro might bring to the larger scale of political discourse, I think there's a necessary evil to a lot of it in regards to how someone might champion a cause or an idea, but I believe that it is necessary within discourse to have a litmus that exists in why or as to how you believe in a particular thing, such as in the current Palestine and Israel conflict, this thing has been transpiring longer than some of us have even been alive. So to simply prescribe a particular notion of genocide or simply look at October 7th as a retaliation, beginning history at one or either point in an attempt to justify all behaviors going forward seems to be a myopic way of viewing history. And it asks the people to search further than what is just being portrayed outwardly. Sure, people might say something occurring is a genocide, but I often ask people to ask themselves what pertains to a genocide and why do you believe it to be a genocide? If you just say people being dead, people dying, buildings being destroyed, then anything by any conceivable faction can be considered a genocide. Some people might even consider the 7/7 bombers genocidal in their actions and behaviors. And if you hold that consistent merit and the way of you quantifying, then I have no qualms about your behavior. But I believe that sometimes people become so virtuous in the championing and campaigning of certain ideas that they start to lose the plot in ways that become very apparent when people get harassed for having a Starbucks cup in their room. Like somehow not supporting that company is going to have enough political sway to stop all conflict within the Middle East. It's just preposterous. It's just nonsensical, but it's enough to allow someone to have the virtue to condemn someone that has a large amount of influence and rigor amongst political discourse or just regular parliaments. So just suffice it to say, I think that there is a necessary evil in discourse that comes from debates. And even when people like Stephen Crowder did prove me wrong, which there is some fallible nature and sometimes his argumentum, but I believe that it was solid for people to ask themselves, I have been thinking this for quite some time, and I've never had someone give me considerable pushback to the point where I had to look into the source, or even that Hassan fan who brought a source and never actually looked into it and couldn't speak to it in a in-depth manner because he hadn't looked at it. He just kind of read a synopsis and didn't know what the figures meant in any meaningful capacity. Or last thing, and I'm sorry, this seems like a long diatribe. I think that it's very fascinating that there are still people who talk about how peaceful things have occurred in certain protesters and still haven't looked at some of the biggest publications and say that anyone who knows the facts of the matter are terminally online despite them being released by large publications with millions of views that are available on places like YouTube. So, yeah. Sorry if I ran on a tangent there, but I think it's interesting.
All right, welcome back from our break, everyone. So we were getting into a lot of the content creation scene that was going on and how a lot of our political views can be shifted from the constant moving of it. But a question I wanted to actually ask for Riddell here is that from your own creative process, when you started developing political content, did you focus on just purely current events? Or did you ever like do like history things or looking back at certain things, like what led us to this point?
For the most part, I tend to talk about kind of current events. For the most part, the more important conversations that are taking place, and not only just like political events that happen, of course, like talking about the recent happenings of Israel, Palestine, or Ukraine, Russia, or the presidential election. A lot of that, of course, but just like the bigger conversation, topics of conversation, pushing the country forward, the points that is on a ballot that people want to talk about, whether it's immigration or systematic racism, stuff like that, because those are the present conversations. Although I do think history is important, especially when you're trying to define terms. Right. I know there's a big conversation nowadays, as mentioned earlier, in terms of what it is. What does genocide mean, or what does insurrection mean? So the value of going in history to define these terms are important beyond the gotcha, you're wrong that this definition is. But it shouldn't. What matters most, in my opinion, at the very least, is the value of why the word is being used and what it means in the grander scale of the situation that it's being. So. To kind of keep it short, yeah, I usually focus on things that are taking place now and the conversations that are taking place.
And if I could ask you a follow-up question, how would you balance staying informed about rapidly changing political news while still producing thoughtful content for your audience?
Well, one thing that it definitely helps is being part of certain newsletters. Now, I make sure that I try to pick sources that I believe are more factual, and I can ascertain whether or not something is more biased based on how it's getting framed, and I go beyond the headlines. But I always make sure I'm using sources that I kind of believe that they're just giving me the facts for the most part. For example, 1440 is a good one in my opinion. Ground News is a good one as well.
That's a good one. I like that.
Yeah. So I use these sources to kind of get updated, of course. One thing that people do all the time, of course, is going on Twitter/X to say, hey, what are people talking about? And that gives you a kind of a baseline on what is happening. But yeah, get these sources coming in, check them out, read them, see which is important, try to figure out what are the facts. If I have to go deeper, I'll dive deeper into it to kind of figure out the nuances behind what is taking place. And at the same time, I understand for the most part the bigger conversations people want to have in terms of, like I said earlier, the big political talking points of abortion, of an immigration. People still not being able to find common ground, so those conversations will always matter. So consistent news sources hitting my mailbox, and also being aware of the conversations people want to have to formulate an opinion that matters, especially during the presidential election.
And last question I'm going to ask on that, but how do you navigate through content creation that is almost like walking a tightrope between being both informative and engaging for your audience? Because I'm sure people like ourselves and this podcast, we can understand certain news could be like watching paint dry, where it's very boring, but it's very important to what's going on, compared to the clickbaity articles. Like, how do you have a good balance of that for your audience, or is keeping them engaged? As if you're a guest, or mainly just your topics?
Well, there's two ways to kind of think about that. Is like the more podcast formats where, I'm having a good conversation with someone. A lot of people appreciate the more bipartisan ways we discuss the topics. But in terms of more consistent content that strays away from the podcast format, it takes a lot of self-reflection to see like what people want. One thing that I've constantly have either said on my platform or thought to myself is that I do believe that there is an issue in terms of information portrayal towards the average person, because there needs to be recognition that the average person, I'm going to put it as bluntly as possible, is a little bit ignorant of how America works and the government works and politics work, and probably doesn't have an extensive knowledge base in general, based on other than the stuff that they consume on a consistent basis, whether that's their job or maybe it's sports or video games or fishing. So you want to make it easy for those type of individuals to understand the information, but also be entertained by the information, and also deem the information or try to figure out why the information is important to them as an individual. So that takes a lot of self-reflection on how to do the content. You want to add a little bit of humor, of course. Titles matter as well. The editing process is also very valuable, giving them visuals that they want to see. It's more than just knowing what you're talking about. It's more than understanding, the wrongs and rights, but it's appealing to the masses that probably matters the most. And which is why someone like a Donald Trump, who I believe is not good, is a master at this craft on how he's able to communicate with the masses. So constant reflection to be able to do that is something I constantly consider, but you have to make it simple and entertaining at the end of the day.
And one more thing I wanted to ask on that, because you have made an interesting point. For people who are listening into the show and are hearing you for the first time, how do you ensure that your commentary is still remaining fact-based while also offering like a unique perspective? Like, what do you do different in this way than other people that you think stands out?
Well, I always try to stick to the facts, and I always try to make it very apparent that I'm not necessarily choosing a side when we're having this conversation. Whether that's a situation where it's me praising your side or me crapping on the other side, just know that this doesn't come from a place of ideologically being captured. So that's what I always try to make clear, but I also try to make clear in my content consistently what I personally think. These are things based off my own value system, and differentiate the personal subjective opinions that I may have, and I'm able to articulate my reasoning versus the facts that I believe matter in this case, is very important in my opinion when it comes to making content. Because a lot of times when you have like a bigger content creator or a content creator in general, they relay information in a way that it seems factual, but it's just their kind of phrasing of the facts in a potentially manipulative way. So I think that is very important. While also at the same time for me, I constantly crap on both sides. So you can never say that I'm left or the right because I do it evenly.
All right. Sounds good. Hey, Z, do you have anything you want to ask him?
Primarily, one of the things I've always thought was interesting about just making content, and especially when it comes to debate and discourse, I think we've had a conversation similar to this on our own platform, but what is the most important facet or factor do you believe plays into you changing your mind about a particular idea or your perspective about something? Are you usually looking towards an argument, rationale, or something of that factor, or are you just usually more of a citation-based sort of like rationale sort of individual?
For the most part, I consider like the overall point that is being made. Now, if there is a point that is being made that has that a certain citation or fact can provide a better understanding or a different perspective, then they're very much appreciated. But at the end of the day, a lot of these points that are being discussed has to align with what I believe makes the most sense from my personal value system and what I think is in the betterment of not only, of course, myself, but it may be cliche to say, but the greater good at the end of the day. So I always try to think of that and what matters most towards whatever is being discussed, whether that's something that is being discussed at an individual level in terms of the morality behind abortion, or what is being discussed based off like the governmental level in terms of the legitimacy of someone calling the election fraudulent or doing a January 6th. So I think about it in terms of what we're talking about and what is the best course for what we're talking about in turn and in terms of the greater good is what matters most. So ultimately, it's based off the main point that is being discussed, how they articulate the point, if that point aligned with my values, and if they're able to kind of prove their point is also very valuable, whether that's sources or citation.
Now to move on to something kind of interesting, I've always wanted to get people's takes about. Usually, when we do discuss episodes on Requiem Radio, we don't usually have someone who is as in tune with what is transpiring on the YouTube sphere of things. So now that you're here, I would like your opinions on some of these content creators that I know you've covered before. Also, you also had a conversation and chat with Rico Rant. For the audience at home, make sure to check out the episode. The episode was pretty amazing. But
it was good to have him on, definitely. Good guy.
Yes, that was definitely a great guy. But for this, I would like, since you've spoken about them to some length, what is your thought process? What is your ideas and thoughts on people like Blair White in general? I know that you've discussed her to some degree about trans issues, since she's kind of like the figurehead of not all trans people, or has to be like the sacrificial lamb to a movement who, for the most part, doesn't believe in general that trans people even exist. But what is your general thoughts about people of that nature? Actually, I think a better question would probably be, since I feel like it's loading that a bit. What do you think? What do you think people who are trans and what their value is to conservative movements are? That'd probably be a better question, because she is extremely influential and she does market herself as a trans conservative. So in terms of effectiveness, what do you think she lies? Or in terms of, I think that's probably the best way to describe it.
Okay. Blair White is a very interesting figure, and I actually respect a lot that, people like Blair White, or even if you kind of cross it towards like people who are a Black conservative talking about issues. I know there's this one content creator, he's a Black gay conservative, and he talks about, issues from that side as a conservative, being Black and gay. So those type of people I do respect. Now, I hate bringing his name up, but it's like a lot of my opinions change about these people the moment Donald Trump is brought into the conversation. And it's quite irritating because they fall in that capture that I believe that they weren't a part of initially. Because my initial interpretation of like people like Blair and people like the guy I mentioned earlier is that despite being an identity that is, you can say, marginalized, definitely a minority, definitely looked down upon for the most part from the right. Despite that, you're able to see the flaws of the kind of political movements that may align with that identity and use that identity to empower the movement itself, i.e. the LGBTQ, or i.e. Black Lives Matter, for example. And you see the flaws. You're able to articulate what those flaws are. You see the bigger problem. You see how it would go against the greater good of the country, the greater good for the identity itself, the greater good for all Americans in general. And you see those problems. Not saying the movement is a problem, but the flaws in itself can be improved. And it's always refreshing when people like that are part of that identity call it out for what it is, and call it out because they see that it's an issue, but they are not against what they're doing. They're against how they're doing. So I do think there's a lot of effectiveness because their words ring louder because they are part of what is going on. The problem is when they kind of set themselves up as being an individual such as that, and then eventually get ideologically captured towards the right. This is not only a criticism for them because their values are shallow, in my opinion. That's why you get pushed further to the right. But also my criticism of the left consistently bullying and pushing these people to the far right in the first place. So that's something I brought up consistently. I do think we need more people like that have that ability to have that kind of fresh mindset regardless of their identity. But they need to have strong enough values to stay 10 toes and not get pushed left and right just because people are being mean to you.
You've been saying that a few times throughout the show, ideologically captured. Can you elaborate more what you mean by that?
So my interpretation of what it is that you allow the ideology in terms of what we're talking about, liberal, leftist, right, Republican, conservative. You'll allow that to basically control all your viewpoints, regardless of what the facts are telling you. You allow that to determine how you think, who you defend, and who you attack, regardless of any other individual value that you may or may not have. It's at the most extreme, something like this would kind of fall into cult-like, where regardless of what the truth may be, what the facts may be, regardless if it's staring at you right in the face, you just have to blindly follow, believe, and support. And we all recognize throughout history how dangerous that can be. So that is what I mean by that.
And do you believe that facts are inherently objective when it comes to politics? As in, there's only one correct answer for something?
No, I think most things are very much so nuanced. That's why I want to go back into the day and age when we're more so talking about policy, because policy is nuanced. That's why I'm never criticizing anyone that is Republican and Democrat that disagrees with certain policies, especially when it comes to certain fine lines. Like, that can be discussed and compromised. That's what compromise is for in the first place. It's just when it gets super unhinged, both on the left or the right. For example, on the left going like, you know what, everybody, abortion up to the third trimester. Now, I'm not like Donald Trump where it says all the lefties think that. Very, 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 very small percentage of people actually think that. But some very small percentage of people do think that. Or the right who thinks that abortion should be banned in every state throughout the United States. Like, those stuff can get unhinged. But for the most part, facts can be objective depending on like what facts we're talking about. But how they're used and certain parts of that facts without context can be dangerously misused.
So I guess my question then for this, if facts can be objective, but a lot of times in politics they aren't, it to me begs the question, to whom is the authority of like what is a correct or true fact and what is a false fact? And that's something I've always seen like people's political ideology as being like a backdrop for, as almost like a pair of glasses, like how you view certain things. You view it during lens. And I'm just a bit curious, like, how do you truly know, like, what is something, upon what authority is this a fact? And this is like just someone's, right wing or left wing opinion or ideological opinion.
Yeah, it's always, those type of things are always tough. And I agree with you, which is why the value of conversation is so important, to narrow out those facts towards a point where there's a semblance of agreement of what is being discussed. And my issue is like, when these facts are being used, what is the intention of the facts being used? At the end of the day, facts and the way they are used can make or can be very dangerous in manipulating the people. And we all want a better country, but if you're doing things that is against the idea of a stronger country, or better yet, if you're doing something to ruin the image of what a strong country is supposed to be, I feel like that can be very dangerous. Like, if you lay out facts saying that, misleading facts, but saying any fact of, oh yeah, there is a percentage of people that are criminals in the country. I mean, of course there is a percentage, sure, but then you're laying out a grand fear across the states at the borders, thinking that there's a criminal left, right, and center. And anytime they see a Latino, and go like, that guy might be a criminal. So what's the intentionality of the facts in that situation? Is it an attempt to bolster your own influence and power, or is it the intent in order to create a better country? Well, and right now, go ahead.
If I may ask, though, again, I'm sorry for giving you pushback here, but for me, it's just a bit peculiar because it seems like we're still pushing the can down the road, if you will, to now you have to consider facts with intentionality with what makes a good nation, which I could argue anyone who has a different belief, if they're genuine in it, I'm sure people who are left wing and they're genuine in their beliefs, they want the country to be better. Same as people who are right wing, they genuinely believe what they're advocating for make the country better. So wouldn't, in a way, just get a bit circular for, being careful not to dismiss them or say, oh, you're viewing it from a right wing perspective when they're genuinely at heart trying to do what's best for the country in their eyes. That's where things get a bit dicey here. So I'm trying to cut through and figure out what do you think the solution is to get around this?
So when you frame it like that, I agree that something that I constantly have to think about is realizing that regardless of the side, for the most part, their intentions are the betterment of the country. The people that I was referring to is people that I believe their intentions aren't for the betterment of the country. Because once you go down and articulate where this line of logic kind of goes down to, of you making these extreme claims that are technically facts, but is making the country broadened in fear, then at that point, I don't think you can get down a logical point of the betterment of the country at that point. But for the average person, I would say that they don't have this type of grander idea. They're usually just told what to think, whether or not that's from the media or social media. And for the most part, yes, it's a little bit selfish in nature because, of course, they live in the country. But for the most part, these people want to live a life that is better than their current life. They want to live a good life. And a good life means a good America and a good community. So they're striving for this type of vision of, like Trump says, making America great. I think it always was, but making America great in their eyes. So I don't think a lot of them have ill intent for the average person. But once you go to the big wigs, the elite, quote unquote, those are the people that I'm talking about can have very negative at that point.
That makes a lot more sense. Thank you for that clarification. Sorry if I was giving you a bit too much pushback there. I was just trying to figure out, in what groups are we talking here? Because you always want to be careful in politics to not demonize the populace. Because, as you know through history, that does not end well for people who go against the populace or the mob. And unfortunately, we all agree here, a lot of people who are into politics, or the layman, if you will, aren't as well informed in politics. They're simply following, like you said, big wigs.
It's it gets unfortunate and it can get a bit frustrating. Bring up Destiny again, which is why he got so unhinged to the point where he was making jokes after that guy died from the Trump assassination. So that's just a perfect representation of the frustration dealing with mobs of people that just are not seeing what you're seeing. So it takes a lot of self-reflection at the end of the day. It takes a lot of being able to understand yourself, but understand what you're trying to do and the purpose behind these conversations that you're trying to have in the first place. The purpose is not proving people are dumb, even though sometimes it's funny to call them dumb. It's kind of hilarious sometimes. But the ultimate point is for a better country, and just making these people hate you even more is not really going to help you.
Yeah, I'm sure Hazy could comment on that too. This is the last thing I'm going to say, and I'll bounce over to him. But there is definitely a distinction between, I'm sure what is called blood sport, as in it's just making your opponent look dumb, and actually having a conversation. And for me, when it comes to more epistemology of what are we talking about in political ideologies, I think I'm kind of the opposite of you, where we can get in this later too, but I don't see people being, excuse me, persuaded by ideologues or ideologies to be inherently bad. I just simply see that as a tool, if that makes any sense. As an ideology is nothing but a mere tool, where it could be used for both good or bad. It all depends on people. I could say it could be used for bad for people like Charlie Kirk, who we could agree is a grifter, but it could be used for good for, let's say, an independent journalist who means well and he's trying to do research. But I'd love to hear Hazy's thoughts, bouncing over to him. Hey, Hazy, are you speaking right now?
Yes, I was actually. Unfortunately, my mic was just turned off. I think the fear of the populace is kind of an interesting dichotomy. To some degree, people always want to prescribe the evils of society as being a byproduct of the higher ups institution political pundits, political figures, and presidents, electoral officials, what have you. However, there's always a separation to the populace at large. I think one of my favorite series that I often look towards is just Avatar, and just kind of how power and hierarchy works in those sorts of situations. And I only use that as an allegory because I think sometimes in certain stories or lessons, there's always an evil king that arises to power, but it just comes to be, it just manifests through the ether. It is never an evaluation of how the people became complacent about their own power, about their own individuality and their own ability, as well as the accountability to the system as it exists. It's rather just a all-abiding evil that is unquestionable and allows you to put aside, embed the level of accountability the populace had at large to allow a figure like that to come to power, which is the biggest problem to allow this. I think it allows people to offshore responsibility. And sometimes I think when it comes to politics, I think there's a bit of hubris. I think there's a bit of ego that plays into a lot of it. You'll see Twitter accounts prescribing and exclaiming, even people like James Charles, to some extent, saying something to the fact of, oh, they could have stopped abortion outright. But we have Democratic presidents in office. And I'm like, so you just don't understand how that works and how Supreme Court judges are majority conservative and how this would have been elected in, and how, like, I think one of my favorite things about this is someone posted something from Schoolhouse Rock, which is something I believe, if I'm not mistaken, from like 1960s to 1970s. It was something akin and comparable to like Sesame Street in terms of its educational and fun aspects to it all. Suffice it to say, they had a song called Bill, which basically explains all the fundamentals of how a bill is passed. And someone just posted it as a quote tweet to what James Charles has said. But I believe that for the most part, it shows a bit of ignorance. And I think that's important for how people criticize the system. I don't mind people criticizing the system, but they do it with an authority that their ignorance is also... Sorry, 1 second.
No, and to get what Hazy was saying too, I agree. And I think this goes back to Riddell and I were saying, is that a lot of the lay people aren't that bright when it comes to politics. I'm not calling everyone stupid now. Put down your pitchforks. I'm saying a lot of people aren't as informed in that sphere, where they go to people like celebrities, or mainly celebrities, to get like information from. Like the fact that someone like LeBron James was actually being aired on like news sites was laughable to me, because I'm thinking to myself, what does a multimillionaire NBA athlete have to say about the common man, the worker, the middle class person? And it's just nothing but like rhetoric of him not knowing what he's talking about. But
yeah, I'm 100% with you. I mean, we got people like Hulk Hogan at the RNC. Oh, yeah. Yeah, well, he has so much great things to say. And no, I'm with you, and that kind of falls in line with another criticism I've had consistently regarding the country, and more specifically education, and how education is being used. Because I mean, I would argue consistently that in the process of people growing up, one of the most important things that people should know is they should know about politics and how the government works, at the very least in a very general level. Some people don't know the three branches, and that's just... It sounds simple, but it's funny the amount of, random TikTok interviews you people have on the streets, and they talk about they can't name three branches of governments, but they can name every song from this B-list SoundCloud rapper. And it just shows you that they were not prepared to be, so to speak, an American citizen, and they weren't prepared to vote. And that is a heavy flaw in terms of the American system, what they're supposed to do in terms of educating the youth as they grow up. It should be more of a focal point to understand government and politics. And there's a way to do it without obviously talking about the individual political ideas. Like, you don't have to talk about abortion or whatever, but teach them how the government works, and teach them about the process, is very important. Teach them about critical thinking, which is something people have been criticizing the public education system consistently. And you can do it in a way that's also entertaining. The amount of people who find, I don't know if you've heard of Model UN or Mock Trial, but those are just like fun debate things that anybody.
High school.
Yeah. So
yeah,
those things should be more integrated into education, and that will help a lot for people to kind of understand a little bit more without being taught politics or taught about the president from a LeBron James or a Hulk Hogan.
Yeah, definitely. And expanding it even more, I find it very important that individuals who are getting into politics do not only look at politics, but expand their horizon to different things that connect to it, because knowledge as a whole for any subject is almost like throwing a giant net out. Basically, you're going to bring in a lot of different fields and a lot of things that are overlap and connect. For example, when we were on your show, we were talking about how much like political theory connects with current day politics today. Or, for example, how much philosophy would connect to politics, or even earlier in this podcast, we mentioned history, the importance of that of politics. Like, imagine someone getting into politics just to argue about Palestine and Israel, and they think this all started at like October 7th. They're going to be way behind on a lot of things, like historically, where they're going to, either side going to be looking bad at if whatever they argue for.
No, I'm with you 100%. I'm going to be honest, even relying on parents to teach you about politics and government is not a foolproof plan. I know a lot of people would say, let the parents teach them X, Y, and Z, but a lot of parents don't know anything about politics and the government. So at some place, if we have the resources to inform people to learn how to do long division and understanding PEMDAS and understanding the mitochondria of a cell, we can teach them the three branches of the government. We can teach them the electoral colleges. And I'm not saying it's not taught in school, because I remember like social studies, of course, and senior year of high school, I took a government and politics class as like an elective. I'm saying it's not taught well, and I'm not saying it's not taught enough. Like, my question, to kind of throw it to you and Hazy, what point do you think in a child's life should they start learning about the American government system?
High school. I think it's
Solo.
I would say high school. I think it's a very crucial point of forming your own identity. And one of the things I noticed about going through puberty, and I believe that for a lot of people who are going through puberty, is that that's the point in which you start to have really, really strong opinions about society. You start to formulate who you are as a person. But I believe that being informed on an early onset about the government and how it functions allow you as a person to understand your own agency and how it functions in general, and how you can be a personal advocate for your beliefs in a more attentive manner than looking from the outskirts and thinking the system does not care for me because there is no immediate effect in the place I reside in. Do you know your local officials? Know your mayor? Do you know who to talk to about trash or waste disposal? These are things that I think once you have a more tangible idea as to the connections you can make within your own confine. We're not even talking on a global state or like countrywide effect. We're just talking about with your next door neighbor and that sort of confine. I think there is a more immediate power that a child who is starting to become their own starts to see in themselves, and it will encourage, I believe, to some degree, a large portion of them to at least seek out what politics is in a greater extent from that thereon. So that's why I think in terms of the most possible age where we can introduce politics into the youth.
Yeah, I would say around 9th, 10th grade, high school as well. And that is only if the requisite of them having adept knowledge of American history, because I find that to be very important to know. I almost see that as like history being a bedrock or foundation for politics, because if you are not knowledgeable in history, I'm sorry, I'm not taking your opinions on politics serious. I'm not saying that to be harsh. I'm not saying anyone has to be an expert or aficionado of history, but just a basic grasp, like what is American history, you know? And I think that's important too. But another thing that's a good litmus test is asking someone, who is your local representative? If they don't know the answer like that, then I'm not going to take them serious. If they're saying things like what Hazy was saying, oh, you know, no one cares about me, XYZ, I'm not getting any help. And something I'd be interested in as well, I'd be curious to, like, this is purely hypothetical speaking, but I'd be curious to have, let's say, in this make-believe America, a change where voters from 18 to, let's say, 21 can only vote at like a local level, like a state level. And then they could vote like presidential next one around, because I think it's more important that they know first and foremost what is going on at a state level that more directly affects them than what is going on at a presidential level. But that's just a purely a hypothesis I'm thinking up in my head.
Fair enough. And I also agree that the local politics should be more valuable compared to the federal elections. But I would say high school is a thought that I probably would say pretty surely maybe a year ago. But I was thinking to myself a lot, maybe a couple months ago, in terms of the, not value, but the, how the best way to put it, something that is a little bit underrated is like the intelligence of a child, the intelligence of a preteen. I mean, it's not a one-to-one, but I think about it back in the day, like back in history, where conflict was much more prevalent and people's life expectancies were much lower, and you would have youth being in charge of whole operations in warfare, teenagers learning about war strategy. And that is like an extreme case in terms of, getting taught some extreme things. But the only reason why I bring that up is I think children have the capacity to learn about politics at middle school. I would even argue in 5th grade. They have the ability to understand the what. What is government? What is the 3 branches of government? What is the Supreme Court? What is local politics? They have the ability to understand the what. Now, the why, I would probably say for like high school, and that would incorporate more like history, because you get to see why things are the way they are. Why are things used the way they are for the people? What led up to how things are right now. But teaching them young,
you have that in reverse though. Sorry to cut you off, but I think, like I said earlier, I agree with you that you could teach a middle schooler politics, but I would just ask, what is the point if they don't have any grounding of like history to know or apply that politics, or to have reasoning skills of like, how has this been done before? Because if I have like a middle school kid, for example, saying, I believe we should seize the means of production, yada, 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 and they don't know any history, and like, hey, you should look into countries that actually tried doing that and what happened to those nations. A lot of them had a lot of famines, a lot of death and starvation. Or on the other coin, if you have a middle schooler saying, we need a strong authoritarian leader who rules with an iron fist, I'd be like, oh, you should check out these historically other countries that tried that and did that and see how they went. Like, that's why I was trying to like pivot earlier and say why it's so important to have history first, then politics, if that makes any sense.
So what I would say in response to that is it does depend. In terms of like understanding the current systems in place and how they work today, I would say you don't need an understanding of history in that part. How it's working today. Now, I said you would need to understand history to understand how we got here, why it's important, and what principles were used to create this function to make America the way it is. And the reason why I say that is because I do think there are things in like the world when you think about the grander reason of why so many things, like there are laws in place in America that once you start asking the why, the average person will have no answer because they didn't think about that in depth. It is very much ingrained the general understanding of these standards, right? So I feel like that if we make it ingrained into their being on understanding what the government is, the why can come later. And I have an example, well, we don't have to go down this example, but it's very eye-opening. For example, why do we have a, what is it called? Age of consent, right? That's a law, that's a standard. We all understand if you mess with someone underage, you are a terrible human being, especially if you're very old or just older in general. But nobody can articulate why that's bad because they really don't know other than it's just bad. So once you really dive into it, then I feel like you'll be able to kind of understand like where this lies in the problematic things that happened in the past, the power dynamics, of course. But overall, I don't necessarily think all the time you need the why first, especially when it comes to things that exist in America that everyone should at the very least have a baseline knowledge of. It should be ingrained into your being and understanding how the American government works. Why it works the way it works, I do think can come later, especially when you have a larger knowledge base and more perspective on what it means to be a person. And you won't get that until you grow up a little bit more. So that why won't have any value until you get that perspective. And even then in high school, you're still very skewed. So until college, I would say is when that why starts valuing, becoming even more important on why things are the way they are.
Okay. Yeah, definitely. And Hazy, do you have anything you want to comment?
I do agree that I still believe that politics should definitely be a fundamental birthing ground for a lot of people when they're starting to become into their own. Since I think for the most part, once you start to have a very bold and strong opinion about who you are, I think this is probably the best time to have a little, like, as for college, I think that's a point when you have a lot of humility about like, okay, I'm not as informed as I thought it was. And you either get reinforced in terms of what you believe, or you start to find people with strong and articulate opinion or equally as informed as you are for discourse, which is why I believe that whether or not conservative, whether or not pro-Israel, I believe that it's important that there is a breeding ground for people to discuss things unfeathered. Because I think it's the last place you're going to really have a large abundance of people with budding ideas who are equally as informed as each other, academia-wise, discussing in a large group of this matter, obviously scientific and things of that nature. But I'm saying just in the sense of just like large social groups. And what I'm referring to, I believe that high school can be the budding ground of like figuring out politics, and then college can be like a strong humility art of like refining and finding out better who you are. Because if you don't have any way to broach it, by the time you get to college, where you're meeting a multitude of people who are insanely informed about these topics, or probably taking majors in particular topics of this nature, you might feel completely out of your depth and not even feel as though it's worth entertaining due to go a gap in like knowledge and how informed you are. I think that's a good place to start, and then college can be like the advanced set of political discourse. I think that can.
What about people who don't go to college though? That's still a large chunk of Americans.
That's the reason why I think it should be a part of high school, because some people might not even go to college, but at the very least they have some knowledge versus it just being exclusively to college and they would never have that knowledge to begin with.
Yeah, agreed. And I guess a funny, really quick thing on what Riddell was saying earlier, the age of consent stuff. I know for us, it's a very obvious no thing. That's gross. And it's 18 for a reason, but I'm not sure if you guys are familiar who Sneeko is, and another guy, his name's Charlie, goes by Moist Critical, but it kind of goes back to the point why history is important, because they want to do a debate on the age of consent. And I don't know why Charlie agreed to this, but for the record, Sneeko's Muslim, so he's going to try to argue for this. But that debate was so painful because Sneeko knew his history like the back of his hand when it came to that topic, unfortunately. And Charlie had zero understanding of the history of this. And it was just like, oh, but it's bad. So although it was an insanely ludicrous topic, almost like debating a flat earther, Sneeko was way more prepared in the history of it wise. And he was able to mat slam Charlie all across the like debate stage, basically. And it was humiliating to watch, where you sit to yourself and think, wow, how do you lose a debate over the age of consent? And it goes back to what I'm saying, because you step into it thinking, oh, I know politics, that's good enough, without knowing history. And it going up against a guy who knows history and politics, so he's going to throw you around. And that's why it's like very important. Yeah.
I would agree with you. I would even add on to what you're saying, that there is a person who does, we've spoken about him a multitude of times on this podcast, but you should be familiar with a person who does spaces about flat earth on Twitter spaces. He does it all the time. For most people, the large populace of America and just the rest of the world of common sense, and it just seems obvious that the world is sphere nature. It's circular. It's a globe, actually. Really leading into the Einstein of theory. Maybe that's just Israel. Please endorse me. But beyond that, if you're talking to someone who's a flat earther, they have such intricate and esoteric knowledge about the subject matter that they can exhaustively discuss this subject matter by giving you extremely poignant questions that you might have even thought about because you had taken it as a given that it was a collective assumed falsehood that the world was in fact flat. So by proxy, you just look uninformed and ill-equipped to discuss this matter. Sneeko did something similar in this facet, where it's, for most people, just consider a collective no, to the point where somebody who's even dating someone in a minor, in this case, happens to be 16 or 18, but one's an adult and one's a minor, it becomes ludicrous. At the same time, Sneeko has no confine in which he considers the age of consent. He'll say maturity, but maturity can be, the placeholder for that could be also puberty, which is one thing he's argued before, that puberty should be a marker, but people can go through puberty as early as 9 and 12, which is why he'll never directly give you a number when he's talking about what should be the age of consent. However, Charlie, just assuming that most people, it's a given, and does not watch Sneeko's content and does not know how much of a dishonest debater he is, just got slapped around in a conversation where he went in with it being accepted as a universal truth that's common sense, that most people just, it's a given that it's not it's not contested, that the age of consent should obviously be 18. But he never, which is why he never investigated further of knowing why. So that debate was terrible for him and terrible for Sneeko for other reasons. But I digress as to why he was so ill-informed and like unprepared. So
I don't even know why he took the debate to begin with. I just don't. But moving away from that point, a question I have for Riddell. I'm sure we could agree that when it comes to politics, I don't think an individual could know or specialize in everything relating to politics, correct?
Of course not. No.
So from your personal perspective, where would you say people who are beginners in the politics or getting into this should start at, or should look into, like, I don't like to use the word specializing, but like put more attention into this than other things?
Well, for me, I think it's at the very least important to understand, one, the three branches of government, right? The three branches, legislative, executive, and judicial, what they do to an extent, very generally, understanding the roles of what each of them do, understand the checks and balances. That way, when a politician is telling you, and the reason, because everything kind of goes into what is my intent behind kind of explaining it this way, is I want the average person not to be lied to by a politician to make them think a certain way, right? It's impossible to say for certain that will always work because, some politicians are very crafty, of course, in terms of how they utilize facts, the narratives that they're trying to push. But in terms of, at the very least, their role and their responsibility, those are things that the average person should know. And if someone tries to say otherwise, you realize that there's a problem here. And once you get a doubt after you hear a lie from a politician, once that doubt creeps in, for the most part, for the average person, they are less likely to just blindly listen to the next thing that they. We just need the doubt happening one time. And they may even be more inclined to look into what they got going on or ignore it altogether and just not follow politics anyway they've been lied to. People are very simple. But having that surface level knowledge, the function of the federal government is important. So you can, be at least a little bit more confident and understand you're not getting lied to. And the second aspect is understanding the value of local politics. If you want change in your area, you need to know local politics is more important. I would say pretty much every person that I've met, unless I tell them this, think that the federal election is more important to them individually than the local politics. They don't even know when the midterm election is. They don't even know that you can vote for it. They don't even know who their governor, mayor, senator is. Local politics, for something as important as local politics, is weirdly underappreciated, which is strange. So that's definitely a place of emphasis.
And who would you say are some political theorists that helped you look more into this, that you've read or inspired you? Whether it's Machiavelli, Aristotle, Locke, Weber, any of these guys like that, Stuart Mill, maybe.
I'll be honest, I don't really have anyone in mind to recommend by any means. I do enjoy philosophy, but it's not something I go out and search for unless it's a political theory that I come up with that I want to see if it's ever been touched upon. For the most part, how I operate is I let my ideas flow. And once it gets to these deeper meanings, then I engage with that point more so, whether that's like when I dove into morality and the origination of morals. That was a big thing that I was doing, or dove into religion a bit. We don't have to get into that. But I don't really dive into political theorists or philosophers much, but I do pay attention to certain ideas and focus on that.
Okay. Hazy, do you have any questions for Riddell at all?
You said there was some political theories and ideas that you were knocking around a bit. Are there any that you would like to divulge to the audience? Some of the things you've been thinking about as of recently?
As of recently, I don't really have anything in mind as of recently, I'll be honest. When I said that earlier, I wasn't stating that I was looking up particular political theories, although obviously I've looked into things that are interesting in terms of like how the government is run. Of course, something that is brought up consistently because nowadays, especially, people are calling everybody communist. Talking about, communism, Marxism, stuff like that, socialism. Oh my goodness, that is brought up constantly.
Or people calling Trump fascist, for example, and they have no idea what fascism is or means.
True, fascism. For the most part, from what I've seen, a lot of political scientists say that he's not a fascist, but he is a big liar, big old liar. So yeah, I don't go out looking over that stuff, but when it's a concept that is constantly used to frame things, I'll look up those, of course. But for the most part, nothing in mind, unless I'm just thinking of a broader idea that I find interesting that I want to dive into the why, of course.
Yeah, that makes sense. And really quick question I have for you, going back to your podcast. I know you recently got back from a hiatus, so welcome back. That's something I'd like to say. But another thing I'm curious about, how many guests would you say, give or take, you've had on your show?
Oh, I keep a record of all of them, so I don't know the number, but I'm just going to look at this list real quick. I would say definitely above 25 guests, above that. So, yeah. Don't know exactly how many, but definitely above 20, but probably above 30. So
all right.
There.
And has there been any guests that you thought were like really, really interesting that stand out in your mind?
Really interesting. Well, other than my former co-host, which, great conversation with both of them. They were really good. I've had someone on, the guy from 1440, the CEO for that. I've had him on to talk about how he got into where he got into, in terms of creating a platform that is supposed to give out information, bipartisan information without bias. That was a very interesting conversation to have. Someone else I spoke to talked about parenting, and we spoke about ways to parent. He actually sent me some of his books as well. And he spoke about certain things that I actually already thought of. Like I said, I think about a lot of different things, but he, obviously, similar lines of thinkings, but he definitely expands on the ideas, focusing on important principles to grow into your kid, such as the value of different perspectives, allowing them to meet different cultures and different types of people, growing that perspective, something that I advocate for consistently, the value of being a humanitarian, finding the goodness, of course. So that was a really good conversation, and because I do think parenting is one of the most important jobs in the world. Another important, interesting conversation is talking with Sarah Wolk, one of my favorite guests, because she talked about star voting. Don't know if you guys have heard of it, but it's a voting reform that allows voting to be more representative based on your wants. It's something that I am a big advocate for. And when you vote, you can even vote for a third-party candidate and not feel ashamed. Instead of the lesser of two evils idea that the current voting process is under, you can vote for multiple candidates by giving them a star ranking. And there's a process with it. So it not only represents your votes, but the people that, if there's more than one person that you really want in, you can make your voice be heard. So that was a really good one. And the last one was, I had someone come on talking about this technology that they are working on to create a paint with a certain type of algae that consumes carbon dioxide that helps reduce carbon emissions, of course. That was a interesting one as well.
All right. And one more question I have for you, because I'm curious. What do you think is a very pressing issue in politics right now that is not talked about enough?
Okay, good thing I did not talked about enough, because I was gonna grill Trump again. Not talked about enough. I mean, I feel like people are talking about it, but it's not a mainstream topic right now, even though it should be. But whether the how do I put this? I feel like this term or phrase is said consistently, but it should be continuously echoed. The whole idea of the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer and the shrinking middle class. We need to, for some reason, the focus on that is diminishing, even though we're supposed to criticize the elites. We're not really focusing on that aspect of, checking the elites necessarily. The conversation is focused on a direction that doesn't really encapsulate the real problem with the wealth disparity in America that is continuously growing. So that's something that I would put on the forefront, that our middle class is disappearing and rich people are getting richer, poor people are getting poorer.
Interesting. Since a lot of people are not focusing on that right now, in terms of what you think are some of the main components that contribute to that right now, would you like to inform any of the audience about any of those facets that you think that people are not being mindful of?
Yeah, there are a few things that I feel like we definitely should be touching upon more so. Obviously, I do think public education plays a huge part on developing people to be contributors in society, being contributors to not only being an American citizen, but being able to go out there on their own, get a proper profession. All the debt that people get into as well is a problem, whether that's credit card debt or student loan debt, and not being able to understand how to utilize their finances in the first place. The aspect of people getting a degree and not doing a job coinciding with their degree, or just struggling to get a job that's even like $40K a year for the most part. So those are aspects, especially in these poor communities, that education, the value of education, I do think is a huge important component. And a tricky part about it is like, and I still don't really have a solid idea about it as of right now, but the aspect of taxing the rich is the question on what is the best method and keeping them in check is hard to say, right? There's conversations that we should tax the rich more. And then there's conversations that are already taxing the rich a lot, and we don't want to scare them away to find loopholes, which they can find loopholes to avoid getting taxed in certain aspects anyway. Or even worse, creating a business overseas and having the American government not being able to touch that. So that's a tricky part of all the rich being having these situations. Obviously, a lot of these financial companies having a lot of stakes and power and influence, such as like a BlackRock, for example, in a lot of these different areas. And whether that's a good or bad thing in the long run is a question, especially from what I've seen at the very least. What's his name? Larry Fink has a very close relationship with certain like government officials. So that one's a little bit more touchy, but that's something that should be a part of the conversation to kind of push the narrative forward. And when it comes to certain programs, this will start touching into like certain benefits and Medicare. Is that being optimized proficiently for people to live their life? Whether or not welfare is actually doing its justice in propelling people past it or keeping them into the situation. Like there's a lot of conversations that are involved, like the poor community, not even really touching upon the capitalism and how it's utilized. But I'm not anti-capitalist by any means. But those conversations, all those different things that I mentioned, I don't think is being a strong enough focus as of right now.
And what's your thoughts overall on immigration?
Immigration, I've said this before. I've actually had someone who said he was a border patrol agent. He came and talked about ways we should, limit illegal immigration. And I feel like for the most part, everybody agrees illegal immigration is not good. But I believe that illegal immigration, not good. Immigration is good. I still believe immigration is a good thing for the country. I like the idea of the country being a melting pot in the first place. And I've, funny enough, when we had this conversation with this Border Patrol agent, I asked him this question: are you anti-immigration? He said no. And then I asked him, would you be in support of a immigration process that is more streamlined and easier so it allows them to get in the country a little bit more efficiently and more quick? And he hesitantly, because I know he didn't want to say it, he hesitantly said, yeah, that would probably be. So once you get down to the nitty gritty, we all can agree illegal immigration is bad. But some people on the right say no immigration. But for the most part, people think immigration, and so do I.
What do you think about Trump's idea for immigration, for letting people in who could get a college degree? Because I know Trump has been talking about that, saying if you could graduate college and show you have a degree, you could get a green card. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I haven't looked into it. Based off your explanation, I wouldn't be mad at that idea. My only hesitancy, because Donald Trump is a liar, is how he plans to implement something like that. Is he going to choose certain types of immigrants? Is he going to say, if they're Muslim, though, they can't get a card. Only if you're like Chinese. Is only the Chinese going to be allowed? Do you have to have a certain GPA for it? I would need these fine details. But the general idea and getting a green card after they graduate in the country, I'm not against the idea. I don't see anything problematic right off the surface other than like spies, so I'm not against it.
Sounds good. Well, we're getting close to wrapping up this episode. We're just going to go through some closing comments. Again, thank you for being on the show. It's amazing having you. Look forward to maybe having you again in the future if something comes up. But also, actually, one last thing I wanted to ask you before I bounce over to Hazy. But who do you got your money on for the 2024 election? Like, who do you think is going to win?
I think, regardless of all the different methods that the Republicans are trying to do, whether that's buying RFK Jr. and buying, what's that girl's name, Tubi something, I still think Kamala Harris is going to edge it out, man. People don't like Donald
Think
Trump.
it's going to be close, or do you think it's going to be a landslide?
I think it's going to be close. Even though I was kind of making fun of bringing in RFK, that was a huge thing for Donald Trump to do. I feel some type of way of RFK.
Yeah, he should have RFK as his VP, not that.
Yeah, JD Vance sucks right now. But
the moment they figured out like his wife was like Hindu, everyone's like, yeah, no, not interested. Like, shouldn't have done that, man. And I just felt bad for the guy. I'm like, dude, know your voting base. Like, why would you do that? But
yeah, and
unfortunate.
I mean, I said Trump, even though like I've been saying throughout the podcast, I don't like Trump. I said he should have brought in Nikki Haley, but after thinking about it, nah, she's a woman. The Republicans won't like that. Can't have her. No, sir. So, yeah.
All right, sounds good. Hazy, bouncing over to you, bud. Any last closing comments you want to have for the podcast?
10 bands on Kamala.
10 bands.
For the most part, I think that Kamala has safely been selling personally for the most part in the race. I have to do a bit of a reverse course on some of the things that have been occurring, but I think some of the reactive nature that has been occurring by conservative media has been kind of funny. One of the funniest posters I think I've seen occur, and I think you've encountered it as well, was the Hodge twin thing when they're like, you don't want for Kamala? Look, and black men in jail.
I'm going for Kamala. I'll just say that.
There was so many replies like, really? Sign me up, bro. I didn't know that was happening. Whoa. Kamala just became my favorite president in the entire world. Wow, look at that. But
yeah, you had all these white ring grifters being like, hey, Kamala's going to lock up record number black people, and then all these right wing weirds like, wait, really? Is she? I may be interested in this ticket. Oh my gosh, it was so bad. But I'm sorry about that. Go ahead, Hazy.
It was the funniest thing, I think. One of the funniest reality checks of the Hodge twins had, like, yeah, man, you don't want to vote for that. Like, they're like, no, yeah, totally, sign us up, fantastic. Give me 14 a day. Sort of response. But I believe that if I was to put money on it, if I was to even have an entertaining bet for this podcast and anything of that nature, I would be humbly okay with putting out $50 for whatever. Well, actually, you know what? I'm a man of my word. And anyone who wants to harass me on social media later down the line about this, I'm willing to put down $50 to be donated to whatever sort of project is going on, whatever sort of community thing is going on.
Let's make it more specific. Do you think it's going to be close? Do you think it's going to be a landslide?
I don't believe it's going to be a landslide. I do believe it's going to be a close race. I think fanaticism for Trump is at its highest. I don't think there's a single thing that really could be done wrong. And I believe that the assassination attempt that had recently occurred has made people more enamored than anything, and only has reaffirmed a lot of victim complex for Donald Trump to be seen as a savior of all politics that is occurring as of right now. So I do believe there will still be a close race. I do believe there's a bit of his allegiance, people who have been saying they've been voted for him or going to vote for him. And even now, there's a more passionate enthusiasm to do so. So I still believe it's going to be a close race, but I do believe Kamala Harris is going to I don't believe it's going to be a landslide. It's going to be close.
All right, sounds good. What about you, Riddell? Thanks for being on the show, man. You got any closing comments for us?
Closing comments. Team Kamala, even though I prefer neither, but Team Kamala. And, I'm just ready for this Donald Trump era to be finished. I'm so ready for it to be finished. We can move on. And, hey, man, I'm going to advocate it for. If we want to start, diversifying the politicians, voting reform is the way to go. So shout out Star Voting. Go support that.
Sounds good. Hey, Hazy, I'm okay putting 20 down, not 40.
All right. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Just for the memes. Yeah.
Just for the memes.
Let's go. $20.
Whatever
So
conservative charity that Sola chooses, I'm willing to put down $40
yeah, that
for that.
conservative charity is called the Vatican. So yeah, I hope you're ready to write that check.
100%.
So really quick. The date is August 26, 2024, where Hazy and I at 8:18 p.m. Eastern Standard Time agreed to this bet of $20. So if you will go back and listen to it. But yeah, that's been all for us, folks. Riddell, thank you again, man. It's been a pleasure having you on. I hope you're doing well. It's good to have you back on a podcast, Scene and Consecration. Oh, before you go, do you have anything that you're excited for upcoming for your platform that you're doing? Any certain guests you're getting on?
Well, just to kind of reiterate what I said earlier, so I plan to, and I've had a few people actually hit me up, even though I was on hiatus, which were pretty interesting guests. But my vision for my podcast moving forward, which I'll be dropping an episode on platforms and YouTube every Wednesday at like 8 p.m. EST or something like that. My vision is that I'm going to have 1v1 conversation between two opposing sides. I will moderate with my nuanced opinions. I will be objective, but I'll be pushing the conversation forward. I'm not going to be a moderator, just say, oh, don't yell. No, I'm going to be making sure the conversation gets pushed forward and we don't get into the entrapments of, circular logic. So that is what I'm doing moving forward. And the 1v1 conversations, I think, will be much more productive than like a group panel, because sometimes it just gets a little bit chaotic. And we're going to have some good conversations, starting off with Kamala Harris versus Donald Trump. I got to find a good Donald Trump supporter, because a lot of Trump supporters that I see don't know what they're talking about. And if we really got into a conversation, it'll get pretty nasty. So I got to find a really good, smart, educated Donald Trump. It'll be tough.
I'll hit you up after this. I think I know a guy for you. But yeah, sounds good. But hey, guys, this has been our episode of Requiem Radio. Thank you all for tuning in, and we will see you in the next episode. Have a good one.